Hello and welcome to this clean historical Western romance by Shelfie Bennett. We're thrilled to have you join us. Before we dive in, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. Your support in these small ways helps us bring you more heartwarming romance stories at no cost. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself be swept away into a world of adventure, love, and unforgettable characters. Enjoy! This audiobook is copyrighted by Shelfie Bennett. Chapter 1: Newfound Burdens. Cece clutched the twine handles of her grocery sack a little tighter and pressed her lips together in a show of calm that belied her churning stomach. After weeks of scrimping, she'd finally managed to purchase flour and coffee beans, praying they would stretch until she could sell a few more eggs from her father's ranch. When she spotted Harvey and Boone across the street, her steps faltered, but she forced herself forward. She would not let them see her shrink away. Harvey's shoulders rolled back as he stepped onto the boardwalk, blocking her path. "Well, if it ain't the half-breed," he drawled, pronouncing every syllable like an accusation. The groceries seemed to double in weight in Cece's arms, yet she held herself tall. She was more than their scornful stares. Boone, a little wiry man with a constant sneer, sidled closer. "Haven blood," he muttered just loudly enough for her to hear. He flicked a glance toward her sun-bronzed face and the faded calico dress she wore. "No wonder trouble's been brewing in town ever since you showed up." Cece's heart hammered. She'd been born here, spent nearly all her life in Fremont Gulch. The only difference was that her mother had been Comanche, a heritage these men regarded with hate. She swallowed the bitterness threatening to clog her throat. "Step aside, please," she said, voice steady. Harvey crossed his arms. "Got no reason to let you pass so easy. Maybe we want to see what's in that bag." His gaze swept over her, from her scuffed boots to her braided hair, like she was a curiosity at a carnival. She refused to respond to such contempt. Still, the knot of dread between her ribs grew tight as a snare. She inched sideways, hoping to slip around them, but Harvey mirrored her movement, an ugly smirk lighting his features. Boone gave a low chuckle. "Ain't got your pa to protect you, do you?" Grief pricked her at the mention of her father. She smoothed down her skirt with one hand, struggling not to let them see how their words sliced her inside. "Leave me be," she managed, voice quiet yet unwavering. The street around them hushed. A few curious onlookers pretended not to stare, but Cece felt every gaze boring holes into her pride. She braced herself for what might come next, desperately praying these men would get bored and move on. But their stance made clear this wasn't going to be that simple. Each passing second hummed with tension, a coil tightening until she feared it would snap. She breathed in, firmed her grip on her groceries, and prepared to fight for her dignity if she must, even in a place that had never cared to extend any to her. Wes McAllister stood on the opposite side of the street, his tall, lean frame leaning casually against the hitching post outside the saloon. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the dirt, but the oppressive heat still hung in the air, thick and unyielding. He had noticed the woman with the groceries moments before, her determined stride as she made her way down the street, her shoulders squared, her face set in that stubborn way he'd seen in men, and he supposed women, who had to carry more weight than they shouldered. The two men in front of her, Harvey and Boone, had been far too quick to pick on her. Wes could feel it, the tension in the air, a quiet promise of trouble. He was no stranger to that kind of thing. He had been the one starting it more than once in his past. But today, something in him refused to sit idly by and watch. He pushed off from the post and started across the street with a steady, purposeful stride, his hand resting near the worn handle of his revolver. Not to draw it, but to let those two know he wasn't a man to be ignored. By the time he reached them, Harvey had a cruel sneer plastered on his face, his bulky arms crossed as he stood blocking Cece's path. Boone, his wiry companion, was laughing under his breath, eyes darting between Cece and Harvey like they were waiting for some signal. Wes didn't give them a chance to escalate further. "You two better step aside," Wes said, his voice low but firm. He stood between them and Cece, taller than both of them, his presence quiet but undeniable. Harvey's gaze flicked over him, taking in the worn hat and the dusty boots. He gave Wes a hard look, sizing him up. "What's your business here, stranger?" he growled, but there was a hesitation in his voice. Wes didn't flinch. "My business is to make sure decent folks can walk down a damn street without being harassed. Now, you want to test me or you want to walk away?" Boone snickered again, but it was quieter this time, a little unsure. "We were just talking to the lady here. Ain't nobody gonna stand in our way." "No, you were trying to make her feel like she didn't belong," Wes countered, his voice colder now. "So, here's how it's gonna go. You leave her be, or you leave in a hurry." Harvey's eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance in them. But something in Wes's unyielding stance made him hesitate. Boone shot him a glance, clearly looking for the same reassurance, but neither of them wanted to push it further. A tense moment passed before Harvey stepped back, cursing under his breath as he waved a dismissive hand at Cece. "We'll let you off easy this time, girl," he muttered. Then he turned to Boone and the two of them slinked off toward the saloon, muttering insults. But the energy had shifted. They knew better than to push things further. Wes turned slowly to look at Cece, his stance relaxing just a fraction. He tipped his hat to her. "You all right?" Cece's heart still raced, the weight of their words and stares pressing against her chest, but she managed a small nod. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She wasn't sure what to make of him yet, this stranger who had come out of nowhere. Was he another one of those men who only stopped to fight when it suited them? Before she could ask or say anything else, Sheriff Beaumont appeared at the corner of the street, his boots heavy against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. He glared at Wes first, then at Cece, as though he could read the situation in the dust. "I don't want no trouble in my town," Sheriff Beaumont said gruffly, his sharp eyes flicking between the two of them. "And I don't want to see you two stirring things up, either." Wes stood tall, meeting the sheriff's eyes without flinching. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Sheriff. Just trying to keep a lady from being pushed around." The sheriff didn't soften, but there was a flicker of understanding in his gaze. "Just remember, there's a line between standing up for someone and making it worse. Stay on the right side of it." Wes nodded, tipping his hat in the sheriff's direction. Cece felt the brief but solid weight of the moment, the relief of being free of Harvey and Boone, but she wasn't sure what to make of the man who had stepped in for her. Was he as straightforward as he seemed, or was there something more to him, something darker? Wes turned to leave, his boots kicking up dust as he walked away, his shadow long and lean in the fading light. Cece stood there for a moment, uncertain. She wasn't used to receiving kindness from strangers. Not without some hidden cost. She'd seen men like him before, men who intervened for no reason other than to settle some personal score or claim a favor later, but for now all she could feel was gratitude. Grateful that the tension had diffused, that she could once again take a breath without fearing that things would spiral out of control. Still, she couldn't shake the thought that she might never see him again, and that was just fine. Yet something stirred in her chest as she watched him disappear down the street. It wasn't just gratitude. There was curiosity there, too, a question that hovered in the back of her mind. What was it that made him stop? She didn't have an answer yet. But there was time enough for that. Cece's fingers trembled as she slid the few coins across the counter. She tried not to look at Mr. Woodrow as he took the money, his weathered hands slow and deliberate. The shelves around them creaked with the weight of supplies, flour, salt, canned vegetables, and the soft hum of the store was almost soothing, if not for the uncomfortable silence that hung between them. "Mixed folks always bring trouble," Mr. Woodrow muttered under his breath, his voice low and bitter. The words weren't meant for her ears, but they landed like a slap against her skin, sharp and searing. Cece didn't flinch, though it took every ounce of strength not to. Her fingers curled around the change that rattled in her palm. A moment of hesitation, and then she forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Thank you," she said, her voice tight as she reached for her sack of groceries. Mr. Woodrow didn't respond. He didn't need to. His narrowed eyes followed her as she turned and made her way toward the door, like she was nothing more than a troublesome gust of wind he wished would pass. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, refusing to let her shoulders slump. Every day in this town, it felt like another weight was added to the pile. She didn't know how much more she could carry, but she didn't have a choice. The door creaked open, and the warm afternoon light flooded the small space. Outside, the dusty street seemed no different than it always had, but it felt colder to Cece today. Colder because she knew no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she gave, she would never be enough for the people here. Not with her bloodline. Cece's hand tightened on the grocery bag as she stepped into the street, her boots kicking up little clouds of dust. The street was still, too still, like the quiet before a storm. She forced herself to keep walking, even though she could feel every set of eyes on her, every whisper that passed between townsfolk. She would get home, and that would be that. But then, she spotted him. Wes McAllister stood leaning against the hitching post, his long legs stretched out in front of him, one boot casually hooked over the bottom rung. His dusty hat sat low over his brow, but she could feel his eyes on her, steady, calm, not full of judgment like the others. The lines of his face were soft, with something unreadable, but there was no malice there. She thought about turning back, pretending she hadn't seen him. He had already done enough for her today, and the last thing she needed was more attention. But before she could make her decision, he pushed off the post and walked toward her, his movements slow but purposeful. "Hey," he called, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man who had so easily sized down Harvey and Boone. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for earlier. I didn't mean to cause a scene." Cece looked at him, his words catching her off guard. She had expected him to walk away without a word, to leave her in the same place she had always been, alone, with no one to help, no one to understand. But here he was, standing in front of her with an apology in his eyes. "It's all right," she said, forcing herself to look up at him. "I'm used to it." He nodded slowly, as if he understood something deeper than she had said. He shifted his weight, his eyes scanning the street behind her. "Doesn't make it right," he said quietly. "No," she agreed softly, her voice catching for just a moment. The lump in her throat was too big to swallow, but she pushed it down. "But it's what it is." They both stood there for a moment, the silence between them heavy. She felt something in him, something that mirrored her own exhaustion, but she wasn't sure what it was. A shared sense of being the outsider, maybe, or just a mutual understanding of the weight of the world. Finally, Wes shifted, his gaze drifting to the sack of groceries in her hands. He raised an eyebrow, his voice teasing in a way that made her heart skip. "You sure you're not needing a hand with those? Seems like you've got your hands full already." Cece looked down at the sack and then back up at him. "I can manage," she said, trying to keep her tone light. It was only half true. She had grown used to carrying more than her share, more than anyone could expect. She had learned how to balance it, how to carry the weight of others' expectations even when it made her heart ache. But Wes wasn't finished. "Your ranch still needin' help?" he asked, his voice steady but with an undertone of something, concern maybe, or something else she couldn't quite name. Cece hesitated, the question hanging between them like an unspoken offer. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to keep her distance, to hide the truth of her situation, but she did. She wasn't ready to trust anyone. Not yet. She shook her head slightly, keeping her gaze a little too focused on the ground. "I'm fine," she said, her voice firmer this time. "I'll manage." Wes didn't push. Instead, he gave a slow nod, tipping his hat with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "All right, then. Just know I'm here if you change your mind." She watched him for a moment longer, trying to read his face, but he was already turning away. He moved with that same quiet confidence that made it hard to ignore him, as if he had no intention of letting her go. He paused at the end of the street, looking over his shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Cece," he called out. Her chest tightened at the sound of her name on his lips. "You too, Wes," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. As he disappeared into the growing shadows of the late afternoon, Cece stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a strange promise. One she wasn't sure she could trust, but one she wanted to. A glimmer of something, hope maybe, flickered in her chest, but it was quickly swallowed by the familiar ache of uncertainty. The town would always be what it was, but maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Cece's boots sank into the dry earth as she trudged across the overgrown pasture, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The homestead, once her father's pride and joy, now stood in silent ruin. The old barn was leaning to one side, its roof sagging with age and neglect, the wooden slats cracked and weathered. The wind whispered through the gaps in the walls, carrying with it the sound of what used to be, what could have been, if things had been different. She paused, her hand resting on the rotting fence post, eyes scanning the yard. It had once been alive with the sounds of animals, the laughter of her father as he taught her how to ride, and her mother's soft voice as she hummed while tending to the garden. But now, there was nothing but the faint rustling of dry grass, the occasional creak of wood in the breeze, and the heavy silence that hung over the place like a shroud. The fence was still standing, but barely. The posts had been weathered down by time, and several were leaning at precarious angles, threatening to fall. Cece's heart sank as she stepped closer, her fingers tracing the worn wood. Her father had built this fence with his own hands, his sweat and labor etched into every post, every nail. And now here it was, falling apart piece by piece, just like everything else. She knelt down to inspect the damage, the scent of the dry earth rising to meet her. Her hands moved almost mechanically, pulling at the loose boards, trying to figure out how she could patch the broken fence, how she could make it last just a little longer. She could feel the burn of frustration building in her chest, her fingers sore from the effort. But then, the memory hit her. The warmth of the sun on her back, the sound of her mother's voice drifting through the air. Her mother's soft humming had always been a comfort, a lullaby for the soul, a sound that had filled their home with a kind of peace that Cece hadn't realized was rare until she no longer heard it. She remembered her mother's hands, delicate but strong as they worked in the garden, planting herbs and flowers that scented the air with their sweetness. Her father had taught her to saddle a horse, his strong hands guiding hers as they worked together to fit the leather straps. He had been patient with her, always taking the time to show her the right way, even when she was clumsy. She could still see him standing next to her, his back straight and proud, watching as she fumbled with the reins. But now those memories felt like ghosts, like whispers of a life that could never be again. Her father had passed, and her mother had followed shortly after, leaving Cece to fend for herself. There was no one left to teach her, no one to help her fix the things that were broken. She was alone. The wind shifted, stirring the dry grass at her feet, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the breeze wash over her. She could almost hear her mother's voice again, soft and reassuring, as though the years hadn't passed at all. "You're strong, Cece. You're capable. You can do this." But even as she remembered her mother's words, doubt crept into her heart. Could she really do this? Could she keep this ranch running on her own with no one to help her? The work was endless, and it was always just her and the land. And the land was unforgiving. She wasn't sure how much more she could give before she had nothing left. Cece stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands, and looked out across the homestead. The wind tugged at her hair, ruffling it around her face, but she didn't move. There was nothing more she could do here today. The roof on the barn would have to wait. The fence would have to wait. She had done all she could, and still it felt like it wasn't enough. A hollow ache settled in her chest, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the constant battle to keep things together. It was too much. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. As she turned to head back to the house, a sigh escaped her lips. The house, like the barn, was in no better shape. The roof leaked when it rained, the windows were drafty, and the doors creaked with every gust of wind. It was a far cry from the home she had once known, the home that had been filled with love and laughter. Now it felt cold and empty, just like everything else. Cece's eyes moved across the land one last time, the fading light of the afternoon casting long shadows over the property. She wasn't sure if she could do this, if she could keep everything going. But one thing was certain. She wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. She would fight. She would fight for this ranch, for the memories of her parents, for the life they had built here. It was all she had left. With a last, lingering look at the barn, Cece straightened her shoulders, squared her jaw, and walked back toward the house. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it was hers to walk, and she would walk it. One step at a time. The sound of hooves approaching drew Cece's gaze to the horizon, where a rider emerged from the dust. The horse's hooves clicked steadily against the dry earth, its rider silhouetted against the pale sky. She stood still, her heart thudding in her chest, uncertainty blooming inside her like a knot she couldn't untangle. The stranger was tall, with a steady posture that suggested confidence, though not arrogance. His hat was pulled low over his brow, and his duster coat fluttered slightly as the horse trotted toward her, a few strands of dust swirling in its wake. Cece felt a tightness in her chest as the figure grew nearer, and instinctively she took a step back, her hand resting on the handle of the rake she had been using to gather stray hay around the barn. The rider reined in the horse, his boots hitting the ground with a firm thud as he dismounted. He stood for a moment, eyes scanning the ranch, his expression unreadable, but steady. Then he looked directly at her, a small, respectful nod accompanying his words. "Afternoon, ma'am," he greeted in a voice that was low and clear, but with a hint of weariness in it, as though the journey had taken its toll. Cece crossed her arms defensively over her chest, instinctively retreating into herself. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, keeping her voice cool. She wasn't used to strangers riding up to her land, and she certainly didn't appreciate the idea of someone poking around, offering unsolicited help. The man paused for a moment, eyes flickering to the barn in the distance, then back to her. "I've been asking around town. Heard your place could use some repairs." He gave a slight tilt of his head, indicating the sagging barn and the crooked fences. "I'm Wes McAllister. I was hoping you might need an extra pair of hands." Cece's brows knitted together. She didn't like the idea of some unknown man showing up on her land, no matter how earnestly he spoke. "I can handle things just fine, thank you," she replied, her tone firm but not unkind. Wes stood a little straighter, his gaze not pleading but calm. "I didn't mean to impose, ma'am," he said, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I've been traveling for a while, and I could use a little work. If you've got some fences that need mending, I'd be happy to do it in exchange for a meal, maybe a little wage if things improve around here." His offer hung in the air between them, simple and sincere. Cece's mind raced, the wariness and suspicion rising within her. She wasn't sure if she could trust this man, or if it was even wise to let him help. What if he asked for more than she could give? What if he caused trouble? Or worse, had a reason for being here that she couldn't fathom? Still, the silence between them stretched, and the creak of the barn's decaying wood seemed louder in the absence of words. She turned her head slightly, her gaze shifting to the worn-out fence, the splintered wood that needed fixing, the gap where the cattle had been escaping more frequently in the last few days. The work was endless, and her strength had been wearing thin. The thought of one more task to complete, of struggling alone with no one to help her, made her stomach tighten. She glanced back at Wes. His expression was patient, waiting but not demanding, and something about his quiet assurance made her hesitate. For the first time in days, the weight of the ranch, the pressure of it all, seemed a little less heavy. He was offering to help, nothing more, no strings attached. Cece let out a slow breath, her shoulders sagging slightly as she weighed her options. She had always done everything herself, relied on her own two hands. But as she stared at the man before her, there was a flicker of something, hope, perhaps, or the simplest desire not to bear the burden alone anymore. "I can't promise much," she said, finally uncrossing her arms, the hesitation still lingering in her voice. "But if you're serious about it, I'll take your help. There's a lot to fix around here." Wes nodded, the faintest of smiles gracing his lips. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll get started on those fences right away." He moved with purpose, heading toward the pile of old timber and tools she'd been meaning to use. She followed his movements for a moment, unsure of how to feel, before finally turning back toward the house. There was still a wariness in her chest, a reluctance to trust, but beneath it, a small sense of relief began to unfurl. Maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to carry this weight alone any longer. As Wes began to gather the wood, Cece stood for a moment, watching him from the porch. Her heart still beat a little faster than usual, the uncertainty of the situation settling over her like a cloud, but there was something else there too. A glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, the smallest spark of hope. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land, the breeze stirring the dust at her feet. For the first time in a while, Cece allowed herself to let the weight of the world ease just a little. She wasn't sure where this new path would lead, or if she was making the right decision, but for now, the sound of Wes's steady work, the scraping of wood against nails, was a comfort she hadn't known she needed. As she turned back to the house, the light seemed a little warmer, the world a little less empty. Perhaps, for once, the burden didn't have to be hers alone. Chapter 2. Building Trust. The steady rhythm of hammering echoed through the dry, sun-baked air as Wes worked to set the last of the new posts into the ground. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, dust coating the edges of his sleeves, but he moved with practiced ease, each swing of the hammer deliberate and sure. Cece stood nearby, securing the wire between posts, her fingers deftly twisting the metal, the repetitive task almost meditative in its simplicity. She caught herself glancing at him from time to time. He was focused, his face serious, brow furrowed as he worked. There was a quiet intensity to the way he moved, as though every motion was deliberate, thoughtful. The muscles in his back shifted beneath his worn shirt as he lifted the hammer again, and Cece couldn't help but notice how his movements seemed both effortless and strong, a man who had worked with his hands for as long as he could remember. Cece quickly looked away, pretending to concentrate on the wires she was wrapping around the post. She wasn't sure what she felt. Admiration, perhaps? Or something more? A curiosity that unsettled her more than it should. She had always prided herself on doing everything herself, on handling the work alone, but with Wes, it was different. She had to admit, for the first time in a long while, it felt like the work wasn't quite as heavy with him around. The sun was high, the heat oppressive, and Cece felt a trickle of sweat run down the back of her neck. She grabbed the canteen from the ground and walked over to Wes, who paused to wipe his brow with the back of his hand. He glanced up at her, his face lit with a quiet, reserved smile. "Thought you might be thirsty," she said, her voice slightly hoarse from the dry heat. She handed him the canteen, watching as he unscrewed the cap and took a long drink. "Appreciate it," Wes said, his voice warm but low, a hint of something unspoken in his eyes. He handed the canteen back to her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, not uncomfortable, but with an undercurrent of something neither of them acknowledged. Cece took a long sip, savoring the cool water as it slid down her throat. She felt the quiet hum of the moment, the shared effort, the way they moved in sync without speaking. Her hands trembled slightly as she replaced the cap on the canteen. It wasn't from the heat, she knew. It was something else. "Where'd you grow up?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. It was small talk, but it felt like it had a weight to it. Wes looked at her for a long moment, as though deciding whether to answer. His eyes were guarded, but there was something in them, a depth that made her curious, something that hinted at a past he wasn't ready to share. "Grew up in a little town up north," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Life wasn't always easy, but we made do." Cece nodded, not pushing. She understood the language of hard work, of doing what was necessary to survive. She wondered if that was all he would say about it. She didn't press further, respecting the unspoken boundaries they both seemed to share. "And you?" Wes asked, his voice breaking the silence. "Where'd you learn how to handle all this?" Cece glanced at the fence, at the posts they had set and the wire they had stretched tight between them. Her hands lingered on the wire for a moment before she answered. "My father taught me how to do it. He was a good man. He didn't have much, but he made sure I knew how to take care of this place." She paused, her throat tight for a brief moment. "He wasn't around long after my mother passed." Wes nodded, though he didn't say anything right away. He understood. There was a silence between them that wasn't awkward, just the quiet comfort of two people who had both known loss, who had both been left to pick up the pieces on their own. They worked in companionable silence for a while longer, stretching the wire taut, setting more posts. Every now and then, Wes would glance at her, and Cece caught him doing it more than once. She wasn't sure what it was, but something in the way he looked at her made her feel exposed, but not in a bad way. There was something kind about it, like he was seeing her in a way that others hadn't. As the afternoon wore on, their efforts began to take shape. Each post standing taller, the wire pulled tighter, the ranch beginning to look more like the place it once was. Cece felt a flicker of something inside her, a sense of accomplishment, but also a quiet pride in the work they had done together. It was different with him in ways she couldn't explain, not just the work, but the unspoken understanding between them. She caught him looking at her again, and this time she didn't look away. His gaze lingered for just a moment longer than usual, a silent understanding passing between them. She was grateful for the help, but there was something else there too, a flicker of something unspoken, something they'd both sensed, but didn't yet name. Wes was the first to break the silence. "You work hard," he said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "Not many people would have kept this place going after all that's happened." Cece's chest tightened, a mix of pride and something else. She didn't know how to answer, so she simply nodded. "It's all I've got left," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place, these memories, it's all I have of them." Wes didn't respond immediately, but his expression softened, a rare understanding flickering in his eyes. He didn't need to say anything more. He was here, and he had helped. And for the first time in a long while, Cece felt a little less alone. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the land, Cece and Wes worked side by side, the rhythm of their movements in sync. There was an ease to it now, a comfort in the silence between them, and in the way they both understood what it meant to fight for something that was slipping through your fingers. They finished the stretch of fence just as the light began to fade, and Wes straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked over at her, his expression thoughtful, but the quiet flicker of something else, something more personal, still lingered. "You're doing good here," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You've got a lot of heart, Cece." Cece met his gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't used to compliments, but this one felt different. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded, her lips curling into a small, appreciative smile. The day's work was done, but something else had begun, a shift between them, something that neither of them could name yet, but both could feel. Cece had always done everything on her own, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the quiet warmth of a kindred spirit beside her. As Wes gathered his tools and moved toward his horse, Cece stood there for a moment longer, watching him. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. She didn't have to face it alone. Not anymore. Cece's hands moved with practiced ease, ladling the thick, hearty stew into 2 bowls. The rich scent of beef, potatoes, and herbs filled the small kitchen, curling into the air like a warm embrace. The hearth crackled softly in the corner, casting a golden glow across the room as the late afternoon sun filtered through the window, the light soft and gentle as it bathed the worn wooden floor. Wes sat at the small wooden table, his hat resting on the chair beside him, his coat draped across the back. His hands were still covered in dust from the work on the fence, but he made no move to wipe them as he watched her, his quiet gaze steady but not intrusive. Cece placed the bowls in front of him, careful to avoid looking directly at him as she did. Her fingers trembled slightly as she set the spoon beside his bowl, but she quickly pulled her hand away, silently scolding herself. She wasn't sure why it felt different, having him here, sharing this simple meal, but it did. He gave her a small, appreciative smile as he picked up his spoon, the light in his eyes warm but guarded. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I'm not used to being invited in like this." Cece nodded, lifting her own bowl to her lips. She hadn't expected him to stay for supper, hadn't known what to expect at all when she'd offered him a meal. It wasn't much, just stew and cornbread, but it was what she had. And somehow, having him there, sitting at her table, made the room feel a little less empty. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the sounds of spoon against bowl filling the gaps between them. The food was good, simple but satisfying, and Cece found herself relaxing a little, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing as she let the warmth of the meal sink in. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. "I've heard there are a lot of storms out here," Wes said, breaking the silence. "Bad ones that tear through the land. Never know when they'll hit," Cece nodded, setting her bowl down as she folded her hands in her lap. "That's the way it is out here. One minute the sky's clear, the next, a storm can roll in without warning. We had a big one a couple months back. Wind so fierce it nearly tore the barn roof off." "Must have been hell," Wes remarked, his voice quiet but with an edge of empathy. Cece looked up at him then, meeting his eyes for the first time since they'd started eating. She could see the faint shadow of something in his gaze, a flicker of understanding, of something unspoken between them. She didn't know what it was exactly, but she felt it. The quiet bond that had begun to form between them, made stronger by the shared isolation they both knew too well. "Yeah," she said, her voice soft. "It was. Took us 2 days to fix the barn afterward, and that was with me and my father working side by side. He never let me quit, not even when I wanted to. He believed in me." Wes's gaze softened, the silence between them deepening. It was strange how much they seemed to have in common, even though their lives had been so different. Both had known hardship. Both had carried burdens that no one else could understand. "What about you?" Cece asked before she could stop herself, her curiosity rising despite her wariness. "What made you come this far out? Most people settle down in town." Wes's expression shifted, but only slightly. His eyes clouded for a moment, a flicker of something darker crossing his face before he masked it again. "Rough times," he said, his voice quieter now, almost like he was choosing his words carefully. "The kind of times that make you want to keep moving, you know how it is." Cece studied him, searching his face for any hint of what he meant by that. She'd heard the whispers in town, the stories that followed him, the rumors about his past, about the trouble he'd been in. But something in his voice, in the way he looked away for a moment, told her there was more to the story. He wasn't ready to share it, and she wasn't going to press him for it. Not yet. "You don't have to tell me," she said softly, her eyes lowering to the bowl in front of her. "I understand." They were quiet for a moment, the air between them thick with things neither of them had said. Cece could feel the unspoken weight of both their histories hanging over them. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a quiet understanding, a recognition that they both carried scars, but they weren't defined by them. At least, not yet. Finally, Wes spoke again, his voice low but earnest. "I don't get people like you, Cece," he said, looking at her through the dimming light. "People who keep going no matter how hard it gets. You've got a lot of fight in you, a lot of heart." Cece looked up at him, startled by the sincerity in his words. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to hearing things like that, not from people who didn't know her, who hadn't seen what she'd had to endure. "I had to learn," she said softly, her throat tightening. "When you're on your own, you don't have a choice. You either keep going, or you let everything fall apart." Wes's eyes softened, and for a moment the distance between them seemed to fade, replaced by something warmer, something she couldn't quite define. The silence between them was comfortable now, shared, as though they both understood exactly what the other had been through. "Thank you for trusting me enough to share this meal," Wes said, his voice quiet but full of meaning. "I don't take that lightly." Cece's chest tightened for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't sure why, but something inside her shifted, something that made her feel both vulnerable and a little lighter. Trust had never come easy for her, not in a town that had never fully accepted her, not after all the losses she'd suffered. But with Wes, there was something different. She wasn't sure if it was the way he listened to her or the quiet way he respected her boundaries, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could let her guard down a little. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't trust easily, but it's easier with you. Wes didn't say anything at first, but his expression softened. He gave her a small smile, the kind that made her heart flutter in a way she didn't expect. As the last of the sunlight faded from the room, Cece glanced out the window. The evening was settling in, and the quiet hum of crickets filled the air, a soft promise that the world, no matter how hard, could still hold moments of peace. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken understanding between them. And as Cece cleared the table, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope, a quiet belief that the days ahead might not be so hard to face, after all. Chapter 3, Whispers in Town. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over Fremont Gulch as the morning wore on. The town's main street was a familiar sight, dust swirling along the wooden sidewalks, the creak of wagon wheels on the rough road, and the occasional call of a hawker peddling goods. But for Cece, today felt different. As she walked toward the general store, she could feel eyes on her, the weight of unspoken judgment heavy in the air. Inside the store, Mr. Woodrow stood behind the counter, his sharp eyes scanning the room as he sorted through a stack of papers. As usual, he didn't bother to greet her. Cece was well accustomed to his disdain, but today there was something more in the air, a whispering undercurrent that she couldn't ignore. Outside, the low murmur of conversation reached her ears, and she paused for a moment, recognizing some familiar voices. Sheriff Beaumont stood nearby, his watchful gaze sweeping over the street as he conversed with a few of the town's men. Among them was Mr. Woodrow, his voice just above a whisper, though loud enough to carry in the stillness. "You heard about that man, haven't you?" Woodrow asked, his voice full of suspicion. "Not the drifter," another voice chimed in, a woman's voice this time, tinged with concern. "I've seen him at the store, buying supplies with that damned revolver on his hip. He's trouble, mark my words." Cece's chest tightened. She had hoped the town wouldn't notice Wes, that he might remain a quiet presence, just a stranger passing through, but it seemed her fears were well-founded. The whispers were already growing louder. "Not just any drifter," Woodrow continued, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial murmur. "The half-breed's gotten herself a companion. Wonder what kind of trouble they're up to. You mark my words, Sheriff, she'll bring the devil right to our doorstep. And that man with her, well, let's just say his reputation precedes him." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but Cece could feel the weight of his watchful eyes as they lingered on her. His presence was like a shadow over her, always observing, never quite giving anything away. The townsfolk's gossip was only growing, feeding the fire of suspicion. She felt their eyes on her, as if they could see through her skin, see the shame they believed should be there. Wes was the topic of every conversation. The whispers were louder now, tinged with fear and distrust. The townspeople had always looked at her with skepticism. Her mixed heritage made her an easy target, but now, with Wes's arrival, their collective suspicion was morphing into something darker. "Don't want your problems spilling over to me, Cece," Woodrow muttered as she stepped up to the counter. His eyes flicked over her, and she could feel the judgment in his gaze. "People talk. The sheriff, the bank, they're all watching you now." She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just here for the usual, Mr. Woodrow," she said, her voice steady but strained. He handed her the sack of goods with a quick motion, his demeanor cool, but his words followed her like a shadow. "Watch yourself, Cece. This town doesn't take kindly to strangers, especially not ones with a past." Cece nodded, her stomach churning as she tucked the sack under her arm. She left the store as quickly as she could, the whispers still swirling in the air around her like a thick fog. There was no way to ignore the growing tension in the town. She had known it was coming, but she hadn't expected it to feel so suffocating. Her next stop was the bank. As she walked down the street, the weight of the rumors pressed on her. making every step feel like an eternity. When she arrived at the bank, the coolness of the building was a small relief from the heat of the sun. The familiar scent of polished wood and dust filled the air as she stepped up to the counter. Mr. Jenkins, the banker, looked at her with a practiced neutrality, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of the unease he felt. "Morning, Ms. Greyfeather. What can I do for you today?" "I need an extension on my loan," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been doing what I can to get the ranch back in order, but the repairs have been more than I anticipated." Mr. Jenkins paused, his fingers drumming lightly on the wooden counter. "I've heard talks, CC," he said, his tone guarded. "You're not the only one trying to make a living out here. And that man," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "that man working with you, I've heard things. Rumors." CC's stomach tightened. She knew where this conversation was heading, but she wasn't ready to face it. "It's just Wes," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He's helping me with repairs. That's all, I assure you. There's nothing to worry about." Mr. Jenkins didn't look convinced. He straightened, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. "People don't always tell the truth about their pasts, CC. I've heard whispers about his involvement in some unsavory things, about the company he keeps. I can't have that sort of trouble attached to my bank." Cece's heart sank. She had hoped for a little more understanding, a little more time, but the weight of the town's suspicions was a force she couldn't escape. "I can pay," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I just need more time." Mr. Jenkins sighed, his fingers brushing the edge of a ledger as if considering his next move. "I'll extend the payment deadline," he said finally, though there was a hint of reluctance in his voice. "But if anything else stirs up, if any trouble follows that man, you won't get another chance. Understood?" Cece nodded, her throat tight with the weight of the warning. "Understood," she managed, though the fear and uncertainty gripped her chest, making it hard to breathe. She left the bank with a tight knot of worry in her stomach, the weight of Mr. Jenkins's ultimatum hanging over her. The world outside felt just as suffocating as it had inside the bank. The town's acceptance was fragile, and she knew it wouldn't take much for it to shatter. Her grip tightened on the sack of goods in her hand as she walked back toward the ranch, the dust swirling around her feet like a storm, an omen that the fragile trust she had gained could disappear just as quickly. With each step, the weight of her situation pressed harder on her shoulders. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep the ranch afloat, or how much longer she could bear the burden of the town's judgment, but one thing was clear: she couldn't do it alone, and the town was only getting colder. The moon would rise tonight, but its light felt too far away to reach. Chapter 4. Glimmers of Hope and Doubt. The soft glow of the morning sun crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink as Cece made her way out of the house. The air was still cool, the early morning dew clinging to the grass beneath her boots. She paused at the edge of the porch for a moment, taking in the quiet of the ranch. The world felt calm, peaceful, almost like a fresh start. As her gaze drifted toward the barn, she saw Wes, his back to her, working diligently atop the roof. The sound of hammering echoed through the stillness, steady and rhythmic. It was clear he had been up for some time, his movements practiced and efficient. The barn, once sagging and unstable, now seemed more secure, the roof straightened, the planks solid. Wes's hard work was evident in the progress he'd made. It was a sight that filled her with quiet gratitude. She approached him, the soft crunch of gravel beneath her boots announcing her arrival. Wes looked over his shoulder, offering her a brief smile before returning to his work. "Morning," he called down, his voice warm with the familiarity that had slowly formed between them. "Morning," Cece replied, her voice steady. She stood for a moment watching him as he secured another beam into place. There was something about the way he worked, his focus, his determination, that stirred something within her. It wasn't just his physical strength that impressed her. It was the way he threw himself into the task, as though he had a vested interest in the ranch's success. And in a way, he did. He was helping her, after all, in a way she hadn't expected. Wes finished with the roof and climbed down the ladder, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Cece couldn't help but notice the way his muscles shifted beneath his shirt, the strength in his shoulders and arms. She quickly looked away, feeling a faint warmth rise in her cheek. "Looks like you've been busy," Cece remarked, glancing around at the barn. The repairs were more than she could have hoped for. There was a new sense of stability to the place. "I figured it was time," Wes said with a shrug, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "This place is too good to let fall apart." Cece nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude toward him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't expect you to do so much." He smiled, a little shyly this time. "It's nothing. I'm just doing my part." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the unspoken passing between them. The tension that had existed between them earlier was gone now, replaced by a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared effort and mutual respect. They moved to the fence next, working side by side as they stretched wire and hammered in posts. Cece found herself working more smoothly with Wes, each motion in sync with his. There was an ease to their movements now, like they had become a quiet team, united in their efforts. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the work continued, but the strain of it seemed to dissipate. The task at hand didn't feel as daunting with Wes beside her. Each post they set, each piece of wire they pulled tight, felt like a small victory. When the afternoon came, the heat of the day started to settle in, and they took a break by the creek at the edge of the ranch. The cool water sparkled in the sunlight, a welcome relief after hours of hard work. Cece sat down on a large rock, her boots dipped into the water, while Wes washed his hands in the stream, his movements slow and deliberate. Cece watched him for a moment, noticing the weariness in his posture, the way his shoulders seemed to carry more weight than she had realized. "You work hard," she said, breaking the silence. "It's rare to find someone who gives as much as you do." Wes glanced up at her, his expression thoughtful. "I've learned that nothing comes easy. You've got to work for what you want, even if it feels like it's slipping away." Cece nodded, her gaze drifting down to the water. "I know what you mean. After my father passed, well, it's been hard. People don't make it easy for someone like me to succeed. They see my mother's blood in me, and that's all they need to judge me." Her words hung in the air between them, quiet but heavy. She didn't often speak of her mother, and when she did, it was always guarded. But there was something in Wes' eyes, something that invited her to share, to release the weight she had been carrying alone for so long. Wes's voice was soft when he replied, "I don't think people realize how much we all have to fight to keep going. I'm not proud of everything I've done, Cece," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "But I've been through my share of battles, and they don't let you forget." Cece looked at him then, really looked at him. She saw the shadows in his eyes, the quiet burden he carried. She didn't need to know all the details of his past, but she could see the remorse, the genuine regret that seemed to weigh heavily on him. "You don't have to explain yourself," she said softly, a tenderness in her voice that surprised her. "I understand more than you think." They were quiet for a long moment, both lost in their thoughts. Cece's fingers traced the water's edge, the coolness a contrast to the heat of the day. Suddenly, their hands brushed against each other as they reached for the same rock. The touch was brief, but it lingered longer than it should have. Cece's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she looked at him, her heart beating faster than she expected. Wes's gaze locked with hers, and there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the shared moment of touch. It was something deeper, a connection that neither of them had fully acknowledged. But before either of them could say anything, a voice broke the silence. "Well, look who's getting cozy," came a gruff voice from behind them. Cece turned to find Joe Dixon standing at the edge of the creek, his hands on his hips, his expression one of mild concern. He had always been a friend of her father's, and though he meant well, he could be a bit too forward for her liking. "Joe?" she said with a forced smile, standing up quickly. "What brings you out here?" Joe's gaze flicked between her and Wes, his brow furrowing. "Heard some talk in town," he said, his tone serious. Folks are whispering about this drifter and what kind of trouble he might bring. I don't want to see you hurt, Cece, or lose this place over some man with a questionable past." The weight of his words settled heavily in her chest, a tightening that made it hard to breathe. Cece glanced at Wes, whose expression had darkened slightly, but he said nothing. "I trust Wes," Cece said, her voice firmer than she felt. "He's helping me, and that's all. It's more than anyone else has done." Joe studied her for a moment, his expression softening, but the concern didn't leave his eyes. "I just want you to be careful," he said quietly. "The town's not as accepting of outsiders, especially not ones with history." Cece nodded, though the knot in her stomach tightened. She wanted to believe in Wes, to trust that this feeling between them could be something real, something good. But the fear of losing everything, her father's ranch, the only home she had ever known, gnawed at her. As Joe turned and walked away, Cece stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his warning settling over her like a storm cloud. Wes's voice broke through her thoughts. "I didn't mean to bring trouble to your doorstep, Cece," he said, his words quiet but heavy with sincerity. "But I'm not running from anything anymore. I'm here to help. And I won't leave until the work's done." Cece looked at him, her heart torn between trust and doubt. The fading light of the day cast long shadows across the land, and she realized that the decision before her wasn't just about him or the ranch. It was about her own choices, about what she was willing to risk. The sun dipped lower, the shadows lengthening, and Cece stood on the porch, watching the fading light. In the stillness of the evening, she could feel the pull of hope and the weight of the doubts that followed it. Cece's hands shook as she stood by the corral, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. She had been working in the barn earlier, repairing the roof, when a wave of uncertainty overtook her. The words Joe Dixon had said echoed in her mind, a steady hum of worry. "You're trusting him, Cece, but that man's got a past, a dangerous one. What happens when it catches up with him?" Her father's old friend had never been one for subtlety, and his words struck harder than she'd expected. It wasn't just the town whispering about Wes's past. It was Joe, someone she had trusted for years. The nagging doubt, the cold knot in her stomach, it wouldn't go away. She turned her gaze toward the house, watching as Wes worked at the far end of the ranch, his broad back to her. He'd been different the past few days, quieter, more distant. Perhaps he'd felt it too, the unspoken tension that hung between them. She didn't want to doubt him, didn't want to let fear erode what little piece she'd managed to carve out. But something had shifted, and she wasn't sure what. Wes straightened from his task and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He turned, catching sight of her, his eyes lingering for a moment before he walked toward her, his boots kicking up dust with each step. Cece felt her breath catch in her throat, the weight of his quiet presence pressing against her. "I've got to ask you something," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "You said you'd been through some rough times before, but there's talk in town. People are saying things about you." Wes's steps faltered slightly, his expression unreadable as he came to a stop before her. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in them, a flash of guilt, perhaps, or something deeper, buried just beneath the surface. "I know what they're saying," he said quietly, his voice rough. "It's nothing new." Cece's heart tightened. "And what exactly is it?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I need to know. What kind of man are you really, Wes? Because the rumors? They're more than just whispers now." Wes shifted, his gaze shifting to the ground for a moment before meeting her eyes again. The hesitation was brief, but it was there. He didn't want to answer, but there was something about the way she looked at him, a quiet, pressing demand for the truth, that made him exhale slowly, as if bracing himself for the words. "People like to tell stories about folks they don't understand," he said, his voice low, as if the weight of his past was an anchor pulling him deeper. "Some of it's true, some of it isn't. I've made mistakes, Cece. Things I'm not proud of, but I'm not that man anymore." Cece looked at him, her chest tight with a mixture of uncertainty and something else. an inkling of understanding, perhaps. She didn't know what to believe. Her heart wanted to trust him, but her mind was still tethered to the warnings, to the fear that his past would catch up with them both. She swallowed, her voice soft. I want to believe you, but the rumors, what happens if they're right? What if it comes after us? Wes' expression softened and he stepped closer, his voice low, the sincerity in it unmistakable. I'm here, Cece. I'm here because I want to help. 5 mistakes, but I'm not the man they think I am. The air between them was charged, a fragile moment suspended in time. Cece could feel the weight of his words, the quiet desperation in his voice, and yet she couldn't shake the gnawing uncertainty. She had to protect her home, protect what little she had left. Could she afford to trust him? To believe that he was really a different man? Before she could say anything else, the sound of hooves broke through the quiet. Both she and Wes turned toward the sound of the approaching rider. The sheriff. Sheriff Beaumont's horse trotted up the path and he reined in with a practiced ease, his boots hitting the ground with a sharp thud. He stood tall, his posture stiff, the weight of his badge a reminder of the law he represented. Afternoon, Sheriff, Cece said, her voice guarded. She had no love for the man, but she had learned to tolerate him, knowing that he was part of the world she had to navigate. Beaumont's eyes flicked between Cece and Wes, his gaze cold and assessing. I've been hearing things, he said bluntly, his tone clipped. Words come through that a certain individual from your past is in the area. Cece's stomach clenched. She knew exactly who he was talking about. Red Hastings. Beaumont continued, his voice low and accusing. I've heard he's been spotted near town. If he's looking for someone, it's usually trouble. And I'm not going to let it spill over into Fremont Gulch. Wes's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked like he might say something, but he held his tongue, the weight of the sheriff's words pressing on him. Cece could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or frustration, but it was quickly hidden beneath the surface. Beaumont's gaze sharpened as he turned towards Cece. I need you to understand something, Miss Greyfeather. If trouble comes to this town because of him, I'll hold you responsible, just as I'll hold him. You're tied to him now. If anything goes wrong, it'll be on your doorstep, just as much as it's on his. Cece felt the breath leave her chest in a rush. She hadn't known what to say, hadn't known how to respond. Her gaze flicked to Wes, and for the first time since she had let him onto her land, she felt a knot of dread settle deep within her. Don't make any trouble for me, Miss Greyfeather, the sheriff said, his tone almost a warning. You've got a lot to lose. As he turned to leave, Wes's eyes lingered on Cece, his expression unreadable. The silence between them was suffocating, filled with unspoken words and 1,000 questions neither of them dared to voice. Cece stood frozen for a long moment, the weight of the sheriff's words pressing on her chest. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted, and she wasn't sure where she stood anymore. As the sheriff's silhouette faded into the distance, the ranch seemed quieter than before. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. Cece stood on the porch, watching the fading light of the day, her heart torn between trust and doubt. It felt as though the fragile peace she had fought for was slipping through her fingers, and she didn't know if she could hold on much longer. The night was coming, and with it the storm that neither she nor Wes could outrun. The lantern flickered on the small table by the hearth, casting long, trembling shadows across the dimly lit room. The house, though simple, had once felt like a sanctuary for Cece, a place where she could take refuge from the world outside. Now, it seemed far too small, the walls pressing in on her as doubt swirled like a gathering storm. She lay wide awake in the bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence between her and Wes growing louder with each passing minute. The weight of the sheriff's words, the warning of trouble, of consequences of the past coming back to haunt them both, had settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something, that Wes hadn't been entirely honest with her. She had trusted him, had allowed him to become part of her world, and yet there was a lingering fear that his past might ruin everything she had worked for. What if she was wrong? What if the rumors were true? Unable to bear the weight of her thoughts any longer, Cece rose from the bed, her feet cold against the wooden floor. She walked quietly to the kitchen, where the dim glow of the lantern still flickered, casting an orange hue on the walls. Wes was sitting at the table, his hand wrapped around a mug of coffee, his face shadowed by the same unease that gripped her. He had been awake too, though he hadn't said a word, hadn't moved, as if waiting for her to come to him. "Wes," she said, her voice soft but firm, breaking the silence between them. She couldn't keep it inside any longer. "I need you to tell me the truth." Wes looked up, his expression unreadable, the weight of his past etched deeply in the lines of his face. "I told you everything you need to know," he said quietly, his voice tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "No," she replied, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the back of the chair. "You haven't. You've told me about the work you're doing here, but you've never told me who you really are. Not fully." Wes' jaw tightened, and he slowly set his mug down, the sound of it against the table sharp in the quiet room. "Cece," he said, his voice low, "I've told you enough." But Cece wasn't satisfied with the vague answers he had given her before. She needed to understand, needed to know if she was fooling herself by trusting him, by letting him into her life. Her hand pressed against her chest, as if to still the storm inside her. "Please," she whispered, almost pleading. I need to know. I need to know who you are. I can't keep wondering, Wes. I can't." For a long moment, Wes didn't answer. He looked down at the table, his hands resting there, fingers tight and tense. Finally, he exhaled sharply, as if releasing a breath he had been holding for too long. "I rode with a gang," he said quietly, his voice rough with the admission. "Led by Red Hastings." Cece's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the name. Red Hastings. The outlaw whose reputation had spread like wildfire, whose very name sent shivers through the town. The same man the sheriff had warned them about. The same man whose shadow loomed over their lives now. Wes looked up at her, his eyes dark, his expression raw with guilt. "I wasn't always the man I am now," he continued, his voice strained. "I did things I'm not proud of, things I can never take back. But I left that life behind a long time ago. I've tried to make up for it, Cece. I've been trying to live a better life. I want something more than that, more than the trouble I caused." Cece's breath caught in her throat, her mind swirling with the truth of his words. She had known there was more to his story, but hearing it from his lips felt like a blow to her chest. He had been part of something dangerous, something she had always feared. How could she trust someone with a past like that? How could she risk everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, by letting him stay? Yet, despite the fear that gripped her, there was a part of her that felt pity for him, an understanding that went beyond the anger and the hurt. He wasn't that man anymore. She could see it in the way he worked, in the way he treated her, in the way he had stepped in to help when no one else had. But could she truly trust him? Could she take the risk? "I don't want to be that man anymore," Wes said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to hurt you, Cece. I'm not that man. I've paid for what I did, in ways you can't even imagine. But I want to be here. I want to be a better man for you." Cece stood still, the weight of his confession settling over her like a heavy fog. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust him. But her heart was torn, and the fear of losing everything she had built, the ranch, her father's legacy, made her hesitate. "You should have told me sooner," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "You should have trusted me enough to tell me from the beginning." "I didn't want to lose your trust," Wes replied, his eyes filled with regret. "I thought if I told you, you'd send me away. I didn't want to risk it." Cece's heart ached at the rawness in his voice. She knew he was right. If she had known sooner, would she have trusted him? Or would she have pushed him away before he had a chance to prove himself? For a long time they sat in silence, the tension between them thick and palpable. But despite the walls that had grown between them, despite the doubts that lingered in her chest, Cece knew one thing for certain. Wes was here now, and that was something she couldn't ignore. The next morning, the house felt colder than usual. The quiet weight of their conversation the night before still lingered in the air, a quiet tension that neither of them knew how to ease. Cece moved around the kitchen, preparing breakfast with a sense of detachment. The movements were automatic, the routine familiar, but the warmth of the morning seemed distant now. Wes sat at the table, his eyes distant, his movements slow as he loaded the coffee pot. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence was deafening, as though they were both waiting for the other to say something, anything to bridge the distance between them. Finally, Cece placed a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him, her hands shaking just slightly as she set it down. She tried to smile, to pretend everything was normal, but the words they hadn't spoken the night before hung heavy between them. Wes looked at the plate, then at her, his eyes soft but uncertain. "Cece," he said, his voice low. "I'm sorry for not telling you sooner." Cece didn't reply at first. Her eyes were focused on the plate in front of him, her mind racing. She wanted to say something, anything, to fix the rift that had opened between them, but she couldn't find the words. They ate in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts, the cracks in their fragile bond growing wider with each passing moment. When the meal was over, Cece cleared the plates, the weight of the unspoken between them pressing down harder than ever. As the morning wore on, they worked side by side, but the connection they had once shared felt like it was slipping away, leaving only the tension behind. Neither of them knew how to fix it, how to move forward without the trust that had once seemed so easy to build. Cece stood at the window, watching the sun climb higher into the sky. The warmth of the day felt distant, as though the promise of a new beginning had been swallowed by the shadows of doubt. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was teetering on the edge, ready to fall apart with one wrong move. The day was still young, but Cece already knew the hardest part of the journey was ahead of them both. Whether they could face it together, or if they would be torn apart by the weight of their secrets, remained to be seen. Chapter 5. Threats and Ultimatums. Cece's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edges of the chair in front of the banker's desk. Mr. Jenkins sat across from her, his eyes fixed on the ledger before him, his face the picture of practiced indifference. The weight of the silence hung in the air like the scent of dust and parchment, thick and suffocating. She had heard the faint murmurs of gossip in town, seen the subtle way people had begun to look at her when she passed by, but hearing the words now from Mr. Jenkins himself cut deeper than she had anticipated. "I'm afraid I won't be able to extend your loan," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice even, but there was a hardness in it that made her pulse quicken. Cece's heart thudded in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you mean? I've been working every day to get the ranch back in shape. The repairs are almost done. The crops are coming in. I've nearly paid off everything I owe." Jenkins didn't meet her eyes. He shuffled some papers on his desk, deliberately avoiding her gaze. "I've heard rumors about your associate, McAllister. People say he's a man with a past, a criminal one at that. I've also heard whispers about Red Hastings being spotted near town. I can't afford to risk the bank's reputation or assets over this. The risk is too great, Miss Greyfeather." Cece's blood ran cold. She knew where this was heading, but hearing it said so plainly made it all the more real. Her mind raced and her throat constricted as she fought to hold on to her composure. She had worked so hard, had come so far, and now it was all slipping away because of a past she had no control over. "Wes isn't involved with any of that anymore," she said quickly, her voice rising despite her best efforts to remain calm. "He's here to help. He's been working hard to fix things. Please, you can't let his past ruin everything we've worked for. My father built this ranch from nothing. I'm sorry, Miss Greyfeather," Jenkins interrupted, his tone cold. "But my hands are tied. The bank can't continue to support a venture with this kind of uncertainty surrounding it. The rumors are damaging enough, and if there's any truth to them..." His voice trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Cece felt the finality in the air, heavy and suffocating. She opened her mouth to argue again, but the words caught in her throat. There was nothing more she could say. With a stiff nod, Mr. Jenkins turned his attention back to his ledger, signaling the end of their conversation. Cece stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, the weight of the rejection sinking into her chest like a stone. She couldn't bear to look at him any longer. She had already lost. Without another word, she turned and left the office, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed in her mind. The clatter of her boots against the wooden floor seemed deafening as she walked down the hallway and out into the street. Outside, the sun was bright, but it didn't offer any warmth. As Cece stepped onto the boardwalk, the weight of the world pressed down on her. She felt the stares of the townsfolk as they watched her walk past, whispers following her like a shadow. Some of them looked at her with pity, others with judgment, but most just watched from a distance, as though they were waiting for her to fail. Cece's pulse raced as she lifted her chin, trying to steady her breath. The hot sting of humiliation burned at the back of her throat, but she refused to let it show. She had been an outcast for as long as she could remember, but now it felt like the whole town was closing in on her. The bank had been her last hope. Without its support, the ranch and everything she had fought for was as good as lost. She could feel the weight of the town's suspicions settling around her like a heavy blanket. It was a cold comfort to know that they'd always seen her as less, but the sting of it now felt sharper than ever. She heard someone call her name, but she didn't stop. She wasn't sure if it was the sheriff or one of the other townsfolk. She couldn't bear to face them, not now. Not with the fear of losing everything weighing down on her. Instead, she hurried to the hitching post where her horse stood waiting. Her fingers fumbled as she untied the reins, the rope slipping from her grasp. She mounted the horse with a trembling hand and urged it into a trot, the hooves pounding against the dirt as she made her way out of town. As the sound of her horse's hooves faded behind her, Cece's thoughts were consumed by the same overwhelming fear. She had no way out of this. Without the bank's help, without the support of the town, the ranch was lost, and with it, all her hopes for a future that was hers to control. The path to the ranch seemed longer than usual, the wind carrying a whisper of uncertainty with every step. Cece gripped the reins tightly, her chest tight with dread. She needed help. She had to find a way to make it work, to save what little she had left. But what if it was already too late? The question gnawed at her as the town faded from view behind her, the uncertainty in her heart growing heavier with each passing mile. The dust kicked up by the hooves of her horse seemed to reflect the swirling thoughts in her mind. Bitter, unresolved, and ominous. The sky darkened quickly, the fading light casting long shadows over the ranch. The wind had picked up, whispering through the trees, carrying with it an unsettling sense of foreboding. Cece stood on the porch, her eyes scanning the horizon, as if bracing for something she couldn't quite name. Wes was a few steps behind her, his posture tense, his jaw clenched in quiet anticipation. He'd been unusually quiet all evening, his mind clearly preoccupied with the same unease that had settled in Cece's chest. But she knew he wouldn't say anything until it was too late, until it was already here. A distant figure emerged from the darkening landscape, riding toward them on horseback. The outline grew clearer with each passing moment, the figure's gait deliberate, steady, and then, as the rider drew closer, Cece's stomach dropped. There, sitting tall on the horse, was the man who haunted her thoughts, who had lingered in her worst nightmares. Earl Red Hastings. His grin was predatory, his eyes cold and calculating. Red's reputation had followed him like a shadow for years, his name tied to every crime and whispered threat across the frontier. And now, here he was, as if he had every right to be on her land, as if the ranch that had once been her father's and now hers meant nothing. Wes's muscles tensed, his entire body coiling as if ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. But Cece could see that his mind was racing, calculating the danger that Red posed. "Evening, Wes," Red drawled, his voice smooth, laced with mockery. He leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes glinting with something cruel. Well, I see you've managed to settle down in this little paradise. Law-abiding, huh?" He chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. "Funny how that works out for men like you. You've never been much for law, have you?" Wes's hand twitched at his side, but he didn't move. His jaw clenched as he stepped forward, planting himself between Cece and Red, his stance protective but taut with the knowledge that the situation was about to escalate. "I'm not part of your world anymore, Red," Wes said, his voice steady, but with an edge that spoke of the years he'd spent running from the man before him. "I'm here to work, to live a life I can be proud of." Red's grin widened, his eyes narrowing with amusement. "A life you can be proud of?" He laughed, a harsh sound that sent a chill down Cece's spine. "You think you can escape your past? You think you can erase the things you've done, the men you've killed? You're still one of us, Wes. And you're going to help me one last time." Wes' hands clenched into fists at his sides, the veins in his neck standing out. "I'm not helping you with anything, Red. I've got no part in whatever game you're playing." Red's expression darkened, his smile vanishing as quickly as it had come. "You think you have a choice?" "As a stagecoach, Wes, a rich one, loaded with valuables. I want you to help me take it down. You know the plan. You've helped before. This time we take what's ours." Cece's heart pounded in her chest, the fear surging through her like wildfire. She stepped forward, her voice strong, though the tremble of anger and fear was unmistakable. "Not here. Not on my land. You're not taking anything from us." Red's gaze flicked to her, amusement dancing in his eyes. "Oh, I see. The little woman's got fire in her." He turned back to Wes, his voice turning cold, the mockery replaced with something far more dangerous. "You know, it's a shame that the respectable folk will never accept you. They'll never let you forget who you really are, no matter how hard you try to play the part. So why not join me? One last job, Wes. After that, you can ride off into the sunset just like you've always wanted." Cece stood firm, her heart hammering as she stepped closer to Wes, her eyes locked with Red's. "You can threaten him all you want, but you're not taking what's ours. Not now. Not ever." Red's eyes flickered with a flash of anger before he gave a low, mocking chuckle. "You really think you can stop me? You think a little farm girl like you can stand up to me?" Wes's hand moved faster than Cece could register. In a flash, he had shoved Red away, sending the man stumbling back a step. Red's horse snorted in agitation, but Wes didn't flinch. His eyes were hard, a look Cece had rarely seen in him, a combination of determination and something darker, more dangerous. "Don't come back," Wes said, his voice low and filled with finality. "I don't owe you anything. And if you think for 1 second you can walk onto my land and threaten the woman I care about, you're wrong." Red stood still for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied Wes. Cece could feel the tension crackling between them, an electricity that made her want to step back, to flee, but she didn't. She stood her ground beside Wes, her chin lifted, her heart racing. "Well, well," Red said, his voice a dark promise. "You think you can walk away from me? You think you can run and hide? I'll be back. If you don't help me, I'll burn this place to the ground. I'll take what I want, whether you like it or not." With a final venomous glance, Red mounted his horse and turned it around, riding off into the night with the same confident, mocking swagger that had brought him to their doorstep. Cece's breath was shallow, her heart pounding as she watched him disappear into the darkness. She could feel the weight of his threat settling in, the knowledge that he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Wes stood beside her, his face grim, his hands still clenched into fists. "He'll be back," he said, his voice rough with the weight of his guilt. "I didn't want this. I didn't want him to come here. I thought I could leave all of that behind, but Red's not going to let me." Cece looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and empathy. She had known Wes's past was a shadow, something he couldn't fully escape. But now it felt real, tangible. Red was not a threat that would fade into the distance. He was here, and he wouldn't go quietly. "You don't have to do this alone," Cece said, her voice stronger now, despite the fear gnawing at her. "We'll fight him together." Wes looked at her, his eyes filled with something between gratitude and dread. He didn't answer right away, but Cece could feel his silent promise in the way he stood beside her, the strength in his presence. The air between them felt heavy, the silence stretching on, but in that moment, Cece knew one thing for sure. They couldn't face this alone. Red Hastings was a danger, but the bond they shared, however fragile, would hold them together. The sound of the wind in the distance carried a foreboding note, and as Cece glanced up at the moonlit hills, she knew that the storm had only just begun. And in the stillness of the night, the first crack of thunder seemed to echo through the land, threatening, but not yet decisive. The real storm was yet to come. Chapter 6: The Fall and the Test of Love. The early morning was eerily still, the wind howling through the cracks in the ranch house's wooden walls, sending shivers up Cece's spine as she poured coffee into a chipped mug. The smell of the dark brew was bitter, almost too harsh for the quiet house, but it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Wes stood at the window, his back to her, his silhouette tense as he stared out into the distance, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the land, beyond the horizon, where danger seemed to lurk. Cece could feel the weight of the silence between them. They hadn't spoken much since the confrontation with Red, but the unease was palpable, a constant undercurrent that neither of them could escape. Wes's past had come back to haunt them in a way that neither of them had expected, and now they were paying the price. Her fingers trembled as she set the coffee pot back on the stove, her thoughts clouded with fear. Every time the wind howled, it felt like the land itself was warning her of the storm that was about to break. And then, the sound of hooves broke through the silence, sharp and sudden, cutting through the tension in the air. Cece's heart skipped a beat, and she turned to see the sheriff's horse galloping up the dirt road toward the ranch. Sheriff Beaumont pulled up sharply, his horse skidding to a halt just outside the fence. He dismounted quickly, his face set in grim lines, and Cece could see the urgency in his movements. He was sweating, his breath coming in short gasps as he approached them. His eyes flicked to Wes for a moment before landing on Cece, filled with something she couldn't quite name. "Morning, Sheriff," Cece said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. She felt the tension rise, the unspoken words between them thickening with each passing second. Beaumont didn't return her greeting. Instead, he took a deep breath and pushed past the pleasantries. "There's been an ambush," he said quickly, his voice hard. "Last night a stagecoach was robbed. The driver's dead, and the passengers were left stranded out there. Word is, Red Hastings is the prime suspect." Cece's breath caught in her throat. Red. The name echoed in her ears, and she instinctively turned toward Wes. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, but his eyes were already shifting, calculating, as though he was bracing for something much worse. "But why are you here, Sheriff?" Wes asked, his voice tight, the muscles in his jaw working. "You already know I've had nothing to do with Red Hastings. I haven't seen him in years." Beaumont's gaze flicked to Wes, then back to Cece, his expression conflicted. "The thing is," he began, his voice heavy with hesitation, "the town's already talking. They've seen you together. Talked about the help you've been giving her. Wes, and now, with this ambush, well, they're saying you had a hand in it. They're demanding answers, and they're demanding you." Cece's stomach turned as she glanced at Wes. Her heart beat hard in her chest, the fear suddenly a tangible weight. She shook her head, her voice trembling. "No, that's impossible. Wes has been here the whole night. He's done nothing wrong." Beaumont nodded, his face drawn with the kind of weariness that came from being caught between duty and personal conviction. "I know, Cece, I know," he said quietly. "But with the way things are going, I've got no choice but to take him in, just for questioning at least. I've got to do it to keep the peace. If I don't, the townsfolk might take matters into their own hands." The words hit her like a physical blow. She could see the conflict in the sheriff's eyes. He didn't want to do this, but the pressure from the townspeople was too much to ignore. The fear in Cece's chest threatened to spill over, but she swallowed it down. "You can't just take him," she said, her voice growing firmer despite the panic that threatened to choke her. "He's done nothing wrong, Sheriff. You know that." Beaumont's gaze hardened, though there was a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I'm doing what I can to prevent something worse from happening. The vigilantes are already talking, Cece. You don't want them taking matters into their own hands. If Wes doesn't go with me now, it'll look guilty to everyone. And the town will get out of hand." Cece's gaze snapped to Wes. His face was grim, his jaw tight, but he didn't argue. His silence spoke louder than anything else could. He wasn't surprised. He'd known this was coming, and so had she. But that didn't make it any easier. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice breaking as she looked back at the sheriff. "You're going to arrest him?" "I'm not arresting him, Cece. Just taking him in to question him. That's all. But if this goes further..." Cece felt the room spin, the walls closing in. Wes' past had already come crashing into their lives, and now it was threatening to take everything from her. Her ranch, her future, her heart. "Wes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She couldn't bring herself to say anything else. The words felt too heavy, too painful. Wes stepped toward her, his face softening, but the guilt in his eyes made her heart twist. "I'll be back, Cece," he said, his voice rough, but it held a promise, one that felt like it could break at any moment. "I'm not running, I swear," but she wasn't sure if that would be enough. Wes turned and walked toward the sheriff, the finality of his movements as heavy as the weight in her chest. Cece's heart sank, and she could feel the tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This was her fight too. The sheriff turned his back, leading Wes to his horse. Cece's breath hitched as the two of them mounted and began riding toward town. She stood frozen on the porch, her hands clenched into fists, her body trembling with the overwhelming sense of dread that filled her. She could only watch as they disappeared down the road, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Her heart ached with the knowledge that this might be the last time she saw Wes, the man she had come to trust, to love, despite everything. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to her pain, casting a cold light on the land she had fought so hard to protect. Dust kicked up in the wake of the departing horses, swirling in the wind like the sorrowful ghosts of a future that had already begun to slip away. And as Cece stood there, alone on the porch, she realized that the battle for the ranch had only just begun. Wes sat in the dim, cramped holding cell, his arms crossed and his back against the cold stone wall. The harsh light of morning filtered through the iron bars, casting long, jagged shadows on the floor. He could hear the distant sounds of the town stirring, people going about their morning routines, unaware of the man behind bars just a stone's throw away. It felt like a prison for his past, a reminder of all the mistakes he had made, the life he had tried to outrun. He had been in this position before, caught between the choices he'd made and the world that refused to forget them. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. He wasn't just facing the law, he was facing the woman he loved, the life he had tried to build, and a town that had already written him off. A door creaked open, and Sheriff Beaumont stepped into the small jailhouse, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The sheriff's face was drawn, conflicted, as he stood just inside the cell door, his hands resting on his hips. Wes looked up at him, but the sheriff didn't speak immediately, as though the weight of the situation had left him struggling for words. "You don't believe I had anything to do with it, do you?" Wes finally asked, his voice quiet but direct. The sheriff exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I want to believe you, Wes," he said, his voice a mixture of uncertainty and resignation. "But the town's already made up its mind, and with Red Hastings back in town, I can't ignore the facts. I have to do my job." Wes straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I understand your position, Sheriff, but you know I wouldn't go back to that life. I've fought too damn hard to leave it behind. If you let me out of here, we can catch Red. I know where he's hiding, and I can lead you straight to him." Just then, the door to the jail creaked open again, and Joe Dixon stepped inside. He was a familiar face, one Cece trusted, one who had known her father. But his presence here, in this moment, felt like both a lifeline and a reminder of the danger surrounding them. His boots clattered lightly on the floor as he approached Wes's cell. "I overheard something last night," Joe said quietly, his voice low and measured. "Red's been talking about another stagecoach. He's planning to rob it, just like he did last time. And I heard him bragging about it, about how easy it's been and how the laws never caught on. He's going to hit again tonight. Same route, same method." Wes's eyes locked on Joe, the fire of determination sparking in his gaze. "You're sure about this?" Joe nodded, his expression grim. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Sheriff Beaumont's brow furrowed as he glanced between Joe and Wes. His hands twitched at his sides, the hesitation in his eyes showing just how torn he was. "Even if this is true, Wes, how can I trust you? You've got a past, a dangerous one. If I let you out of here, I'm risking my badge, my career, and the safety of the town." Wes stepped forward, his voice urgent. "I know I don't have any right to ask for trust. But I've changed. I swear to you, Sheriff, I've left that life behind. This isn't about me. This is about stopping Red before he hurts anyone else. He's the one with blood on his hands. Let me help you end this. If you don't, this town will never be safe. You'll never be safe." Beaumont stood still, his eyes flicking over Wes's face as if weighing his words. The silence between them stretched, and for a long moment Cece's face filled Wes's mind. She was the reason he had tried to change, the reason he had pushed through the darkest parts of himself. He couldn't lose her, not to Red, not to his past. Finally, the sheriff exhaled, a heavy sigh escaping him. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low. "I'll give you a chance, but this is it, Wes. If you try anything at all, I'll arrest you myself." The glimmer of hope in Wes's chest almost made him smile, but he didn't. He nodded once, sharp and firm. "Thank you, Sheriff. You won't regret it." As the sheriff unlocked the cell and led Wes out, he turned to Joe. "You stay close. We're not taking any chances." Joe gave a slight nod, his eyes flicking toward Wes and then to the door. "I'll keep my distance. You can count on that." The sky was painted in fiery hues as the sun began to set. The rocky outcropping on the outskirts of Fremont Gulch had become their vantage point. Wes, the sheriff, and a small group of deputies crouched behind the jagged rocks, their eyes trained on the path where the stagecoach was expected to come through. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of the wind or scrape of a boot on stone sending them into high alert. Wes's hand rested on the grip of his revolver, his fingers tight around the leather. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he kept his breathing even. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This was his chance to prove he wasn't the man the town thought he was. Through the distance, they could see the figures approaching. Red Hastings and his cohorts were mounted on horseback, moving swiftly and quietly. Red's grin was wide, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the impending robbery. Wes's muscles tensed as Red and his men dismounted, preparing to intercept the stagecoach. It was time. The sheriff gave a sharp nod, and the group sprang into action. Shots rang out, sharp and unforgiving, as the deputies fired at the outlaws, forcing them to take cover behind the rocks. Wes's heart hammered in his chest, but he pushed forward, moving with the others toward Red. In the chaos, Wes saw Red, his eyes flashing with recognition and fury. Red lunged, grabbing for his weapon, but Wes was faster. He closed the distance between them in a flash, disarming Red in a brutal, up-close struggle. They grappled, fists flying, the weight of Wes's past pushing him forward as he fought to stop the man who had haunted him for so long. Finally, with a twist of his body, Wes sent Red sprawling onto the ground. He held the gun at Red's chest, the barrel pointed directly at his former associate. The stagecoach, now safely passed, continued down the road, unaware of the deadly confrontation that had nearly unfolded in the shadows. "Get up." Wes growled, his voice tight with emotion. "It's over." As the deputies closed in, Red's men scattered, retreating into the darkening wilderness. Red was pulled to his feet by the sheriff's men, his face twisted in a snarl. "You won't get away with this, McAllister," Red spat, his eyes burning with hate. But as Wes looked over at the sheriff, he saw something new in the lawman's eyes. A glimmer of respect. The sheriff nodded, his expression softening as he glanced from Wes to Red. "It's over," the sheriff said quietly, his voice low but firm. "You're under arrest." The tension in the air began to dissipate, the danger fading with each passing moment. The townsfolk who had followed the sheriff stood in silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. Wes had done it. He had proven his innocence. Later, as the dust settled and the last of the deputies led Red away, the sheriff met Wes's gaze, his expression hard but acknowledging. "You were right," he said, his voice rough with respect. "You're not the man they thought you were." Wes nodded once, the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders, if only for a moment. Cece's face filled his mind again, and for the first time in a long while he felt the spark of hope. The sun had set, but for Wes, it felt like the first rays of dawn. Cece's heart lifted with each step she took down Fremont Gulch's main street. The morning after the shootout had brought a quiet ripple of change through the town. It was clear in the way people walked, in the way they spoke. The whispers that had once followed her like a heavy shroud were beginning to thin. Here and there, townsfolk greeted her with a nod or a small tentative smile. They hadn't forgotten their suspicions, but the events of the previous day had carved a new understanding into their hearts, one that Cece had never dared hope for. Wes, though, was the one on everyone's mind. His bravery had spread through the streets like wildfire, each retelling adding another layer of respect to his name. The law had cleared him. He had risked his life to protect the stagecoach passengers, putting himself in the line of fire to prevent another robbery, something that the townspeople hadn't expected from the man they had once thought was a dangerous outlaw. It wasn't long before Cece caught sight of Mr. Jenkins, the banker, walking toward her from the direction of the general store. His face was still tight, his expression a little too careful, but there was a subtle change in the air around him, a shift in the way he carried himself. "Miss Greyfeather," Mr. Jenkins greeted, his voice slightly gruffer than usual. He stopped in front of her, hesitating for only a moment. I've reconsidered my earlier decision about your loan." He cleared his throat, his eyes meeting hers with an air of reluctant apology. "I may have acted rashly, given the circumstances." Cece blinked, not sure if she had heard him correctly. She had come to expect nothing from the banker, certainly not an apology. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Your land, your work. It deserves better than the doubt I cast upon it. The town is beginning to see things differently, and I should have done the same sooner." Jenkins's voice softened. "I've reinstated your loan extension. And," he continued after a brief pause, "I've also worked out better terms for you. This place has potential. If you're willing, I'd like to continue investing in it. I've seen what you're doing, and I'll support you moving forward." Cece felt a surge of relief wash over her, so strong it almost knocked her off balance. Her hands trembled as she extended them toward him. "You mean it? I'm willing to put my faith in your future," Mr. Jenkins said with a nod, his usual stern expression softening ever so slightly. "And I'll make sure the others in town know it too." Tears stung at the back of her eyes. The weight of the past weeks, of all the pressure, the fear, the uncertainty, seemed to slip away in that moment. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she and the ranch had a chance. Later that morning, inside the bank's office, Cece sat across from Mr. Jenkins, signing the new paperwork. Her hands shook as she penned her name, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the relief that filled her chest, the sense of possibility that bloomed anew. The ink on the page seemed to cement the future she'd once feared she might lose forever. As Mr. Jenkins handed her the final papers, she realized something deeper. She wasn't just signing for a loan extension, she was signing for a new life, one that she could share with Wes, one where the weight of the past didn't have to define her or her home. "I'll make sure the repairs are done properly," Mr. Jenkins said, his tone lighter now, "and the town will help too. I've spoken with a few folks. There's some support here after all." The sense of community that had once seemed so distant began to feel real. It wasn't just a promise, it was action. The town had started to see her, to see what she and Wes had built here together. As Cece left the bank, her steps light with the knowledge that the future was hers once again, she made her way back to the ranch. She didn't rush. Instead, she took in the landscape. The land her father had fought for, the land that was now hers to fight for. As she passed the freshly repaired fence, she saw Wes standing near the barn, his posture relaxed, though there was a tiredness in his shoulders that made her heart ache. She approached him slowly, her boots crunching softly against the dirt as she closed the distance between them. Wes looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips when he saw her. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice steady but with a hint of concern as he noticed the look on her face. Cece stepped up beside him, her heart full. She didn't need words to convey what she felt. She simply reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his. He turned to face her fully, his gaze searching hers, waiting for her to speak. "Wes, Her voice faltered for a moment, the weight of everything she had experienced settling into her chest. "I signed the papers. The bank's backing us now. The ranch is ours again." Wes's face softened, and for a moment the world seemed to fade away. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as though he never wanted to let go. His breath was steady against her cheek, and she felt the sincerity of the moment, the feeling of having everything fall into place. "I knew you'd make it work," Wes murmured into her hair. "I knew you'd fight for it." Cece smiled, her heart swelling with the emotion of the moment. "We fought for it," she corrected, her fingers gently tracing the outline of his jaw. "Together." There, beneath the wide blue sky, Wes stepped back slightly and reached into his coat pocket. Cece's breath caught in her throat as he pulled out something small, something that glittered faintly in the morning light. "I don't have much," he said quietly, "but I want to give you something that's mine to offer, something that says I'm not going anywhere, that we're in this together forever." With trembling hands, Wes held out a makeshift ring, a simple band shaped from a horseshoe nail. It was rough around the edges, far from perfect, but it was real, a symbol of his commitment, of his love. "Will you marry me, Cece?" he asked, his voice low but filled with so much hope. "Will you make this life with me? Not just the ranch, but all of it. Every step, every breath." Cece's heart skipped a beat, and before she could stop herself, she felt the tears slip down her cheeks. She had never thought she'd find this kind of love, this kind of acceptance. She had never thought she'd be enough for someone like him. But she was, and he was enough for her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Wes, I'll marry you, forever." As he slid the ring onto her finger, Wes kissed her gently, sealing the promise between them. The world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their hearts beating in unison. Together, they had built something that was stronger than anything either of them could have imagined. And together, they would face whatever the future held. Cece stood at the edge of the small gathering, her heart fluttering with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. The air was thick with the heat of midday, the dry earth beneath her boots a reminder that the land, like her, had endured much. Yet here it was, flourishing, vibrant, and full of possibility. The ceremony was simple, but to Cece it was everything. It had been months of doubt, of wondering if the town would ever accept her, if her love for Wes could ever overcome the shadows of the past. But here, in this moment, surrounded by the neighbors who had once whispered behind her back, she could finally feel the weight of those doubts lifting. Some were still stiff, hesitant, but they were here. They had come, not because they had to, but because they were starting to see her, really see her, as part of this community. Wes stood beside her, tall and strong, his eyes soft as he looked at her. He was dressed simply, his dark shirt a contrast to the pale sunlight that bathed them both. His hand rested lightly over hers, his thumb brushing gently against her skin, a silent reassurance that he was right here with her. Sheriff Beaumont, ever the stoic figure, stood a few paces away, his arms crossed in quiet respect. He offered Cece a slight nod, his expression guarded but genuine. He had been the one to set the wheels in motion. to clear Wes's name, to stand by them when no one else had. Though he never spoke of it, Cece could feel his approval, a silent acknowledgement that this was the right thing, even if it had taken time to get here. Joe Dixon, the ever-present friend and ally, stood as a witness, his face softened by the warmth of the occasion. His weathered hands were clasped before him, his gaze fixed on the two of them with a quiet pride. His presence was more than just a formality. It was a sign of the community that had slowly begun to embrace them both. The small group of neighbors, some old, some new, had gathered in a half-circle, their faces a mixture of curiosity and reluctant acceptance. A few lingered on the outskirts, unsure of what to make of the couple, but most had stepped closer, drawn by the simple joy of seeing this union take place, one that marked not just the joining of two hearts, but a victory over the prejudice that had once kept them apart. "Wes," the preacher said, his voice steady and kind, "do you take Cece to be your wife, to stand by her through whatever comes, to love and protect her for better or for worse as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Wes answered, his voice rough but full of conviction. His gaze never wavered from Cece's, and she could feel the weight of his words settle deep within her. The preacher turned to Cece. "Cece, do you take Wes to be your husband, to honor and cherish him, to walk beside him through every challenge for all your days?" Cece's voice trembled as she spoke the words that had felt impossible at one point, words that meant more than she had ever imagined. "I do." The preacher nodded and smiled, his voice ringing out across the small gathering. "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Wes's hand cupped Cece's face gently, his thumb brushing away a stray tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The kiss was soft, a promise, a beginning. It was everything they had fought for, everything they had dreamed of, all wrapped up in that one sweet moment. As they pulled apart, the crowd's applause broke through the stillness. It was hesitant at first, some unsure, others just caught up in the simplicity of the moment. But then, like the land itself, it grew. A few voices joined in, and slowly the sound of clapping filled the air. Cece's heart swelled as she looked around at the faces of the people she had once thought she'd never belonged to. And then, as if to punctuate the moment, Sheriff Beaumont stepped forward. He offered his hand to Wes, a simple gesture of respect. "I may not have always agreed with how you went about things, but you've earned your place here, McAllister," the sheriff said, his voice low but sincere. Wes shook his hand, his eyes meeting Cece's. For the first time, there was no longer any doubt, no more suspicion, no more whispers. They were a part of this place now, a part of this life. The weight of the past had been replaced by the possibility of the future. As the crowd began to disperse, some offering congratulations, others simply nodding in quiet acknowledgement, Cece felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. She had fought for this, fought for the chance to prove herself, to prove that she and Wes belonged here. Now, with their hands joined, she knew she was no longer an outsider. They had both earned their place. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues across the land, and as Cece looked out over the ranch, she saw it as it had always been meant to be, hers, with Wes beside her, with the promise of a future they would face together. "Wes," she said softly, her voice filled with awe, "we did it." "We did," he replied, his smile warm, his arm around her shoulders, "and it's just the beginning." Together they walked toward their future. The land that had once been a symbol of struggle, now transformed into a testament of their love, their resilience, and their new beginning. And as the day slipped into night, Cece knew that the love they shared, born from hardship and tested by time, would flourish just as the land had, just as their future would.